Welcome back to our last panel, and very exciting one indeed. It's starting with comics journalism. We have our guest speaker, Andy Warner, here. I'm going to make sure that we have not lost Lena and Kemal, who will be coming here soon again. And Kate is here. I can see her. Yes, she is. So Andy, or Andrew Warner, is hailing to us from San Francisco. He has had a long trip and many flights to get here. Andy lived here for a few years, many years ago, and has contributed to Samandal as well as a comics artist. But Andy is a comics artist. He is a comics journalist, in fact, and he also lectures at Berkeley University? Stanford, I'm so sorry. At Stanford University on comics. He teaches comics in a class. So I'll leave it to Andy to start our panel. And
thank you so much, Lena. And
Andy has everything ready. No.
I want to thank you for having me as well. It's really wonderful to be back. And thank you all in advance for suffering through me with my jet lag. I will do my best. So I'm a comics journalist. I'm a cartoonist, and the main things that I do are comics nonfiction and comics journalism. And so just a quick couple words about comics journalism. This is obvious to some people that are familiar with it, but other people think that it's writing about comics. When I say comics journalism, I mean using the medium of comics to act as a journalist in the way that a radio journalist uses the medium of radio to act as a journalist. And I can talk a little later about the upsides and the downsides to that. But I'll just sort of start off by talking about the long history of, first of all, almost all my work appears on the internet too. So if this interests you, you can find it all. It's actually sort of a really amazing time for comics journalism right now, specifically because of the internet. And I'll keep returning to this again and again because I love the internet and I also love journalism. And it's really opened up this space by destroying all the gatekeepers. And so I'm an American, and in the US, most journalism that's consumed at this point appears online. People still subscribe to newspapers, but especially generationally, most of the work that you'd see anyway would appear, you'd be reading through your screens, and that removes the barrier of entry, so things can spread on social media. Editors are a little more willing to take a chance on things because, say, for example, printing color comics would be expensive, but disseminating color comics online is the same as disseminating text. So the transition to the connected world really sort of brought down a lot of those barriers and made what I do and what all my compatriots do possible. But way before the internet, way before anything, the intersection of illustrative art and the news is actually a pretty old one. In the early days of the newspapers, this one's from 1855. And this has to do with conflict. And conflict, obviously, is the theme of this symposium, but it's also something that really drives journalism in general and drives comics journalism in specific. And I'll address that later. But editors at the time wanted images from war, because images from war sell. So this is from the Crimean War. So they would actually, photography existed, of course. This is the 1850s, but it was really cumbersome. It was really these, huge machines, and the exposure times were long. So it wasn't really a viable thing to send a photographer to the front lines. So editors would actually send artists to sketch. This happened in the Crimean War. This happened in the American Civil War and the Spanish-American War. And they would send the sketches back to their editors, and then the editors would send them to printmakers and etchers and create these etchings, and they would basically be the way that they sold the newspapers. So this isn't comics, right? This is static. It's not sequential. There's no narrative, but it's a fun little grandfather to the stuff that we do. Another fun, well, not so fun actually, but another really important step on the road to comics journalism, especially in the American tradition, is Minea Kubo, who was a Japanese-American citizen. And she wrote this book, Citizen 13660. And it's about this really dark period in American history where we basically locked up a bunch of our own citizens, Japanese-Americans, during World War II. We sent them to concentration camps in the desert and seized all their property. And it's really sort of undercovered in the national psyche, in history classes. And Mina Yakubu's work is really important. She was actually interned herself from 1942 to 1944. She was originally from, I think, Riverside, California. And while she was in the camp, she made over 2,000 drawings of the camps. And these are actually this amazing, and then she published a book called Citizen 13660. That's a collection of the drawings as well as her personal memoir about it. And some of them are sequential, and so they're sort of getting close to comics. A lot of them are just static. But the really important thing about this is that the military actually didn't allow photographers in the camps, because even then they sort of realized that it was a little bit of a shameful thing they were doing. And they did, in fact, allow like Ansel Adams and a couple other people to come and take photographs, but they were very staged. They were very controlled by the American military. And Mina Yakubu, because she was sketching, because she was drawing, was actually able to visually get across far more than any photographer could have hoped to do. So she was actually documenting this. She was acting as a journalist. And her work is some of the only sort of visual, artistic reference that we have of the Japanese internment by the Americans in World War II. But then, of course, if you're talking about Americans and comics journalism, you always come back to Joe Sacco. He's come up a couple times already. It's actually funny because he isn't technically American, he's Maltese, but he did move to the US when he was 12 years old. He went to high school in the States. He went to college in the States. He briefly moved back to Malta as a young adult, but then has basically lived in the US ever since then. So I count him as one of my own. And he really made his name creating this work of comics journalism called Palestine between 1993 and 1995. And when it was collected, it actually won the American Book Award in 1996 and was really one of the first shots across the bow of comics journalism becoming this really legitimized, respected part of the industry. Nonfiction comics and comics journalism absolutely existed before Joe Sacco, but Joe Sacco had enough success and enough people read him that it created this amazing thing where the subsequent generation of cartoonists, as we sort of pitched our stuff to editors, to publications, they had read Joe Sacco, they had experienced him, and they had absorbed him, and so they already knew that it was okay to take comics seriously, that it was okay to commission work that was writing about important stuff, about conflict, and it wasn't just for kids. Joe Sacco is also a good opportunity for me to talk about why comics journalism at all, right? Because comics take a really long time to do. They're like the most labor-intensive art form there is. And so why do it instead of, say, photographic journalism or the written word? And it's because it affords you special things that only comics affords you. One of them is the integration of these sort of infographics or maps or typographical elements actually into the narrative. So marrying in basically infographics and comics, and you can have this seamless transition of the narrative to information to the narrative. And I think a lot of people are actually really visual learners in the world, and they don't actually get much information given to them in that way. You know, they're mostly reading text. And so I found in my work, people often talk to me about how it helps them understand things in a way that they had not gotten from a prose article, or especially it helps them remember things. I think the association of words and images creates that connection in your mind. Then you have something to go back to when you've archived it there. So Sacco, and then the other really big thing that I think comics is great at is, and sorry for the brutality of this imagery, but is empathy. So this is something that all the visual art forms, and therefore all the visual forms of journalism share, right? War photography is famous for creating empathy. Like when you think about some of the most iconic pictures from the Syrian civil war, it's the children, you know, those images of the kids. And documentary filmmaking always has this huge impact. So comics has this similar thing. We're actually looking at the images, the artist is forcing you to reckon with them. But with comics, what it has that photography doesn't have is it has the narrative. And the difference between it and documentary filmmaking is really interesting to me, because documentary filmmaking, or consuming documentary films is a sort of somewhat passive act. You're sitting there and you're watching it. But when you're reading comics, it's more like prose. You're sitting there and you're actively consuming it. And so as an active consumer of it, you pause. And so when you see an image like this, or an image like this. This is from Sefer Garage Day, and this is from Footnotes in Gaza. The brutality of it and the intricacy of it will actually make the reader stop and sit with the image for longer than they would if it was just passing in front of their eyes. So one thing that Sacco also did that is going to become a major theme of this talk is that Sacco embedded with American troops. In 2004, he embedded with the U.S. Army in Iraq. And so I'm an American. I'm mainly talking about Americans in this talk. And a lot of the conceptions, we're sort of a provincial people. We don't really think about the outside world all that much, except for when we have our notorious military misadventures in them. And a lot of journalism in general focuses around the American military within America. And therefore, a lot of comics journalism does as well. And so Sacco had a huge influence on a whole generation of American comics journalists and comics journalists all around the world. And they not only followed him in his style, in his ideas, but also in his subject matter. So this is a cartoonist, Jess Relifson. This piece came out about 1.5 years ago. And it's also about U.S. military veterans. It's a really interesting story following this Vietnamese American soldier in Afghanistan who's dealing with the fact that as a Vietnamese American, his own parents actually experienced the trauma of American imperialism and American military occupation of their country. And now he is the agent of that very same in another's country. And also the fact that most of the other members of his unit are either white or African American. So as an Asian man, he stands out so much that the local Afghans actually sort of figure out who he is and start making graffiti about him specifically. It's a fantastic story. And she sort of made this whole career of interviewing U.S. Military veterans, especially about Iraq and Afghanistan. And in that same vein, and this will sort of bring us to my own work, is the cartoonist Matt Bors, who started off as an editorial cartoonist. But in 2010, he and another editorial cartoonist, Ted Rall, ran a Kickstarter campaign and raised a bunch of money and sent themselves to Afghanistan to just sort of travel around the country, unembedded, just by themselves. They hired local fixers. And report for Cartoon Movement, this website that some of you may be familiar with, sadly defunct now, but it specialized in comics journalism and nonfiction comics. And then when Cartoon Movement went under, Matt Bors, this cartoonist, went on to found his own publication called The Nib, which is an American website that specializes in comics journalism, political cartoons, and comics nonfiction. And that's where I come in. This is me, because I work for them. So a lot of my own work I both work for them and produce, I produce work for them and work for them. So I edit comics for them, and I'll get into that in a second. But a lot of my own comics appear on there. So I myself first got into doing nonfiction comics through living in this very same city. So when I moved here in 2005, 2 weeks after I arrived, Hariri was assassinated, and the whole, the situation basically went bonkers. And this comic was a little mini comic. It's 20 pages, and it was basically my attempt to unravel that, to unpick the political scene that had contributed to the lead up, and also unpack the aftermath and try to actually figure out what was going on. Silly me. But apparently people thought I did a good enough job of it that it started getting me work, basically doing explainer stuff, sort of explaining complicated matters to other people. So I made comics about the Syrian refugee crisis for Slate. Again, following in Sacco's footsteps, I interviewed U.S. veterans of the Iraq War. I made comics about that. So broadly, my nonfiction comics sort of fall into 2 categories. One is an interview-based sort of form of traditional journalism, where you're actually talking to the people, and then the whole comic is based around their story, your edited version of their story, but That's the narrative. The other one is the explainer, which is also a form of journalism, but it doesn't rely on original reporting, it relies on research. And this is really where, the explainer is where that aspect of schematics comes in, that you can use these maps, you can use flowcharts, you can use all this stuff to sort of help people unpack information. This was a piece about Kurdish politics, because in the US media, Kurds are always portrayed as the best friends of America in a completely uncomplicated way. And I did this article to sort of combat that and talk about the more complicated political scene that was actually unfolding over the borders of 4 countries, but I didn't talk about Iran so much. This was another comic that I did for the Nib that was structured around a timeline that was basically following and looking at the rise of Daesh and the sort of American responsibility for that with de-Baathification and the support of Nouri al-Maliki. This is another example of using those schematics, in this case a timeline, to help organize information so that you absorb it better. And I love maps. I use maps as much as I can. This one was a really interesting piece that I got to do about basically tracing the rise of Boko Haram and looking at how it was really British colonialism in this, taking all these different religious groups, different ethnic groups that really didn't have all that much to do with each other. They had contact with each other, but they weren't up in each other's, business, and smushing them all together into this state opportunistically. And then when colonialism ended, the people that had been smushed together in the state, it was basically up to them to then negotiate the power structures of that state. And that inevitably led to the north of the country, Africa's second largest economy, being mired in really terrible conflict for half a decade. I don't only do comics about sad things and war, though. I want to make that clear. Just as the question, asking about the covers of Samir, that is the focus of this conference, and so I'm mainly showcasing that. But comics journalism is a really wonderful and multivaried way to communicate what you think is the truth or what you understand to be the truth. And so people do all sorts of things with it. This is a comic I did about robots. This is a comic I did about a man who dresses up as a rabbit and threatens people with an axe in 1970s Virginia. I do a ton of stuff. But another really fun thing about comics journalism and about my relationship with the Nib, actually, is that as an editor there, I have the ability to solicit work and edit it. And so I'm able to basically... I have a lot of autonomy there, and the Nib has a mandate of basically just publishing good work from anywhere. And as I previously mentioned, Americans can be a very provincial consuming audience. We tend to only read stuff from America. We tend to only care about stuff from America. And so one of the things we're really trying to do at the Nib is to publish as many nonfiction cartoonists and comics journalists from as many different places as we can. So I just want to close out by taking a quick look at that. This was a piece by Ganzir, the Egyptian artist and cartoonist that I commissioned, which is about, and he, of course, did the famous Mask of Freedom during the 2011 uprising. And then he moved to Los Angeles. And so this was a comic about his very conflicted feelings about sort of leaving his country in the middle of what continues to be a tumultuous time, and the politics of staying versus the politics of packing up and getting out because it's easier. And then one of my favorite pieces that I've commissioned and edited over the past year was this comic by Falat Delibalta, who's a Turkish cartoonist. And Turkey has this, actually I know this thanks to Jonathan, but Turkey has this amazing scene of all these different comics magazines, sort of not unlike France, actually, and they're constantly publishing nasty pictures of Erdogan, and people are getting thrown in jail, and it's just this very hurly-burly thing going on. And this comic was by one of the artists from one of those places, from Le Mans, this magazine. It was talking about the failed coup in 2015 that happened over the summer. So he describes from a personal perspective what happened. The windows shattering because of the sonic boom, waking up in the middle of the night. and also the sort of pervasive element of social media in it, and how social media actually really contributed to being unable to understand what was going on, because there was propaganda on the social media, and then there was partisans on the social media, so nobody even figured out it was a coup until halfway through the second day. But then the thing that he did that was really cool, actually, is that, so he's talking about the truth constantly in this comic, and what is the truth, trying to figure out whether it was a coup or not, who was behind the coup, which is still sort of a mystery to this day. And so he works for this comics magazine, and the comics magazine staff all got together and did a special coup issue about it, which the authorities then seized all the magazines and banned it from distribution. And they still had like a stack of magazines in Istanbul, so they were able to get them out. But his comic ended up being sort of about negotiating the truth in, an increasingly authoritarian regime. And that's really, I guess, the thing that's most exciting to me about comics journalism right now, is that it's just a tool set, and that tool set is available online. And just as my work is only made possible by the internet, this increasing connectivity in these platforms where people can publish stuff and actually have it read by quite wide audiences, it's sort of amazing to me, and I'm really excited for the last 5 years of comics journalism have been this absolutely wild ride. And as long as the economy doesn't melt down or something, but I can only imagine the next 5 years, as we at the Nib are able to publish more and more international cartoonists for an American audience, and just around the world, people have access to these comics everywhere. I'm really excited to see where it'll go. Thank you.
Kate she'll tell you what she's talking about, but Kate is I'm going to list the titles. She's an activist, a writer, a comics artist, and a mother, I think, as listed on her website. I met Kate at Brighton and Justin. At Brighton, where there was a conference on comics and war as well, and her talk about the refugees, I think, was very, very important and enlightening, and as well as a wonderful speaker. So I'll leave you, Kate.
Don't big me up too much. Hi, thank you for the invitation. It's amazing to be here. I'm going to talk about my latest book, Threads from the Refugee Crisis, which is about the situation of refugees who are attempting to get into the UK and the northern France. This is the image that was pulled out by the editors for the cover, and I'm really pleased that they did it, because by highlighting, I know it seems obvious, but to some people, but it doesn't seem obvious to everybody, but refugees happen as a result. And refugees are arriving in Western countries as a result of Western policies, as a result of Western military aggression, and as a result of economic inequality. And I'm really glad that even though most of the book is focusing on very personal individual stories, it's framed by this bombing on the front page. It's actually, this is a specific act of bombing. It's the bombing by American troops of the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in northern Afghanistan, and it resulted in the closure of the hospital. And I mention that only because I told that to a group of comics students at the New School, which is a progressive university in New York, and none of the American students had heard of this event, which I found really shocking. So the comic is based on a blog post that I made after a 3-day visit to Calais, northern France, to go and find out what was happening in the refugee camps there, and to go and physically help. I didn't visit as a cartoonist. I visited just as a person who was trying to be useful, but when I came back, I found like this comic just kind of poured out of me. So setting the scene on the first page, we've got a picture of Calais and the port, and it's a place that I'd visited before. Traditionally, English people go over to France just for a day to go and buy beer and then drive back to England. It's quite a funny little town. But it had changed since I'd last been there. The first thing we see, white fences stream along the highway, meters high, miles long. The smooth steel lacework glistened in the evening sun. And I use the word lacework, and then I build upon this, because I discovered when I was staying in Calais that it used to be a lace-making city. That was the traditional craft of the town. And I immediately realised that I had the visual metaphor to pull the artwork together. Calais, the city, was famous for its lace-making, the meticulous toil of women and girls sitting outside to make the most of the daylight, nimble fingers, bobbins dancing, continuously twisting the threads. And I took the word threads as well, because I feel like it's such a tiny, tiny story that I'm telling of my involvement in the camps compared to all the much, much, much bigger narratives that are being woven together in this sort of crazy carpet of dislocation, of refugee stories that are engulfing the continent. So I just wanted mine to be just one tiny, tiny thread of that. So this is using the threads around the artwork. So when we got there, we found adjacent to the motorway and the fences by it, there was an enormous refugee camp. It was deliberately put there by the French authorities in that they would round up all the itinerant refugees in the area and put them on this piece of wasteland and deny them access. They weren't providing any food, they weren't providing any shelter. The idea was to make conditions as intolerable as possible to try and persuade people to relocate elsewhere. Now, because the residents of the camp are trying to get to the UK, there is a law in the whole of Europe that you must take refuge in the first safe country you come to. So if people have a reason to go to the UK, for example, they have relatives there, they have to stay under the radar the whole way across Europe. They can't have an official presence anywhere. So these are people who are stateless in the most extreme way. They can't apply for any kind of charitable aid. Although there was actually about a third of the residents of the camp had also applied for refuge in France and had still been sent back to the Calais jungle to live. It's massive. I don't know what I thought I'd see, but I didn't expect this. So many people, so much need. A microcosmic disunited nations. And that's what's unusual about the camp at Calais. You don't have one nation of people being displaced from one conflict, but you have Afghans, Sudanese, Eritreans, Syrians, Iraqis. Politicians call them a flood, but of the millions of people around the world fleeing for their lives, this is just a trickle. Maybe 5,000 human beings? Nobody knows exactly. Nobody is counting. These people don't count. I don't generally apologise for my own work in any way because I feel that women do this too much, right? But my artwork's pretty rough on this section, partly because it was just a very quick blog post that I did. And then I looked back and I thought, should I go back and revise that? And I was like, no, it kind of suits the subject matter that it's all been thrown together a bit. Everywhere there's an air of expectation, of impermanence. People who've been on the move for so long are stuck in limbo, tantalisingly close to their destination, but the wrong side of those cruel fences, still so very far. This is cropped down because the original question goes, you're from the UK, yes? And the other guy's going, you can take us to UK? And we're going, sorry? But I left it cropped because that is just what English people are like. English people just say sorry for everything all the time. Sorry, yeah. There are lots of smiles that I didn't expect. Everywhere, little interactions, points of connection, life's threads crossing. So what we did was we went there to make shelters. We're making these crazy shacks, which are basically a square frame knocked together, and they're meant to be for the women and children. Well, I say we did it. I didn't get to do it because there weren't enough tools. So my white privilege grants me the job of guarding the tool tent. We can give out a small handful of nails. I just want a lock. It's not up to me. He's worked all day, but I can't give it to him. We have 3 padlocks in a box and thousands of people wanting them. However pointless it may be locking the door of a dwelling when you can slit the sides with a knife, everyone wants to feel secure. So this is a little kid we met, Shabab. Well, I called him Shabab. Obviously, that's not his real name and that's not his real face. I actually riffed on the image of the Afghan girl that was famous from the Time magazine cover in drawing him, because obviously English people will feel more sympathetic to him if he has green eyes, not brown. But there we go. He's 12, the same age as my son. Where is your mother? Afghanistan. That's sad. He shrugs. He's growing up far too fast. He doesn't look sad, but I never see him smile either. We help him build his house. He's competent with a hammer and over-enthusiastic with a staple gun. My son wouldn't know how to use a hammer unless it was on Minecraft. I give him some grapes out of a maternal concern for his vitamin intake. I feel an urge to scold him for treading down the backs of his shoes. You see, like if you have a 12-year-old boy, you're like, what are you doing to your shoes? But then I realise that everyone does it, that it's a sandal-wearing culture. That'll change when winter starts to bite. So that's a little tiny fragment it's like a 16-page comic that I did as a blog post, and it went viral. And I got quite a lot of feedback from it. The vast majority of it was positive, but not all of it was, which I really like, because if people are moved enough to write hostile reactions to my work, that means that however many people have bothered to tell me what's wrong with it, there will have been a large proportion of... I really don't want my work to just appeal to people who already agree with me. So this many people have seen it who already agree with me, and this many people have seen it who hate me. Well, in the middle, there must be a bunch of people who didn't have an opinion on the subject and were helped to understand it by my work. Also, I got to use the hostile comments when I worked up these ideas into a book. This cartoon could not be better propaganda for battlefield veteran Islamic militant males invading Northern Europe if Lenin himself produced it. The situation would not exist if they very people breaking laws in Calais did not ruin their homelands with ethnic, religious hatred, intolerance and war. You are importing death. It's such an extreme comment that I just had to give it some airtime. But also what I find interesting about engaging with people whose opinions you don't agree with on the internet is that if you read a comment like that, everyone, when they express their opinions, they are doing it from a place which makes sense to them. There is a rationale by which this utterly ludicrous comment can be seen to make sense to someone. So what I like to do is look at this opinion that I disagree with and then try and work out what the person is thinking that might have made them react in that way. In this case, there is a blanket assumption that everyone who is from an Arab country is a terrorist. The two are conflated absolutely with no kind of possible understanding of any other alternative. And so I think, right, okay, I can work with that. I can show you more people who are not terrorists. And I went back to Calais. So there's a couple of ways in which my work helps to recognise the humanity of people in refugees in Calais. One is I was showing people, you can see the humanity of people. So you can see people. And what I'm doing here is I'm drawing portraits of this lad's about 14 years old. And then I give him the picture, and then I draw a cartoon afterwards about my experiences. It's an intimate thing to do, to draw a portrait, to sit and study every feature of the face. The impossibly thick eyelashes, the soft, downy hair growing on the upper lip, the strangely massive Afghan hands. The kid's ears are slightly furry too, very small and rounded. They look padded. I idly wonder if he has his mother's ears, and I wonder how long it is since she last saw him, and I think of her, thinking of him every hour of the day. So those are the kids in the youth centre there. None of them have any parents there with them. And then there's a sequence I drew here where we meet one of the residents who living in the little shacks that we previously made on the previous visit. We all squeeze it. So this is an Iraqi Kurdish guy. I mainly seem to have met Iraqi Kurds and Afghans, which is kind of good given Britain's recent military history of who exactly we've been bombing most. Not all, but most. So we all squeeze into Hoshiar's hut, kick our shoes off. There's only one place to go, a softly padded 7-foot square space. This is Alaz. He lives here too. So that's 2 grown men in an 8-foot shack. They each have a sliver of broken mirror tacked up to shave by. It's well insulated. It would be warmish, except that we have to leave the door open to let in some light. I'll make you some lunch. It's not a question. Hoshiar busies himself in his 18-inch kitchen, knocking 2 eggs together and tipping them into a pan. The sadness temporarily ebbs from his face in the process. Welcoming, cooking, sharing. You can tell that this fits with his sense of how things should be in the world. And England isn't a very hospitable country. People don't spontaneously make people meals and refuse to take any, refuse to not let them accept them, you know. So by showing people being welcoming and looking after me, when I'm the one who's meant to be going out there to look after them, it's great. It's kind of turned round this idea of refugees as invaders, as scroungers on its head, and presented people who are wanting to give something back. We play the let's show each other our families on our phone game. This is my daughter, and then Hoshiar's turn. Here is my mother, my father, my sister, my family home here. The contrast with Hoshiar's current view is stark. What must it be like to be homesick for somewhere that it's not safe for you to be? So, and then this is us making tea. English people do not put that amount of sugar in our tea. How am I? I don't know what I say. The plan is to join his uncle in Croydon, but the longer it takes, the more often he fails to... I haven't really explained, but the only way across the channel is to hide in a lorry. It's a really bizarrely cruel and dangerous way to try and you know. There is a big European meeting at the end of the month. They will work out how to help the refugees, yes. The enormity, the immediacy of the problem is so clear to Hoshiar that it seems obvious that politicians must want to help. But Hoshiar, refugees can't vote. Didn't you know? Immigrants are always feared, always vilified. They hate you, Hoshiar. They think you're a terrorist. That's what we don't say. I've only got about 30 seconds, but I just want to say that there is... I've created more stories. I want to talk a little bit about me as a white Western woman going out and making narratives of other people's cultures, of other people's stories, and say that there is something inherently problematic within that. I mean, to what extent do charity workers continuate inequalities, participate in inequalities? It's a picture of me reinforcing a border that in a situation I didn't want to be in. When you're talking about comics journalism, you're talking about real people's stories, and they don't necessarily have the ability to consent to you making those stories, not an informed consent. They're super, super vulnerable people. So I'm going to leave it on an image of a real conversation that actually happened at the time. I'm going to tell you something, and I want it to remain confidential. I won't draw a cartoon about it, I promise. I did. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite Lena and Kemal. Hello. Our last and most very interesting speakers today with us is Lena Mahesh and Kemal Hakim. They're both Lebanese comics artists. Lena was one of the founders or co-founders of Samandal magazine publication. I don't call it a magazine, a publication, and has produced several graphic novels herself, some translated, and she edited the last version of Samandal. Kemal Hakim is a comics artist, a Lebanese comics artist as well, and he also has his own graphic novel out that is The Time of Grenades, right? And which is in French.
Yep.
We want an Arabic version.
That's my issue. I'm very good in English.
We'll fix it. But I just wanted to say they both worked on a project together, collaborated with other comics artists, and the book is outside, so I really hope you would take a look at it, and they're going to talk about that. And I will leave you.
How shall we start, my dear? You want to start? I start? Okay. Basically, I think that Kate and Andy summed up quite well the whole approach on graphic journalism. So I'm going to be quick and try to put depict my own participation as a graphic journalist. So I'm not going to define the big terms. I'm just going to say that we were approached by Solidarité Internationale, who asked us to go and cover their work in the north. And so it was a work of journalism in a way. So graphically, how could we translate it? What was going to be interesting about it? You arrive there. I chose a space called the Rasoon Tower, which is an amazing spot. You're in the middle of this northern part of Lebanon, which is completely green, and you have this completely surrealistic spot, with this phallic thing, coming out of nowhere, that was supposed to be a very fancy restaurant in a very rural area. And so suddenly I definitely had stories coming, and I was very much inspired to tell stories about this spot.
Should I jump to?
Yeah, let's go back to the origin maybe. So refugees, so I used a bit of Joe Sacco's autobiographical graphic journalism, which basically is all about, you as a narrator is the major thread in the story, and your role is to pick up little stories and little portraits and put them as the big show. There are other authors that are as important, as interesting as Joe Sacco, but different. You have Lisa Mandel, who covered also the jungle of Calais for the newspaper Le Monde. You have Patrick Chapat for Les Echos, Switzerland. You have Guy Delisle, who has also this way of tackling graphic journalism, but in a much more neutral stance. Like Guy Delisle, I think, falls under the category of the journalist who wants to be objective. Joe Sacco has this very interesting way of defining the method. You're, as a journalist, trying to reach out for objectivity or for honesty. What is it exactly that you're trying to get? So I think that the subjective side, me as a Lebanese, going to meet up with Syrian refugees and talk about, Syrian displaced, sorry, it's not refugees, and talk about, their conditions, is not going to be an objective thing. There's a lot of history behind it. As a Lebanese, I'm not as Joe Sacco, who's coming to Palestine, who can play, the neutrality card, or like Guy Delisle going through the Chronique of Jerusalem and talk also from a very neutral stance. There is a lot of emotions coming in it. And obviously, the first thing I confronted was, meeting up with the Syrians. They look at me as the Lebanese and they were like, what are you doing here? Like, first of all, you're a graphic, you're doing a cartoon. How is this going to help us? You're not the original foreigner, because when you're a foreigner, obviously anything can pass. But you're an Arab. You're coming to do a graphic novel. There's a bunch of questions that are more interesting to depict. Now, I always wanted to tell the stories of the Middle East through an Arabic point of view. I was a bit tired of always seeing that, foreigners, through the Orientalist experience and depiction, were capable of communicating through modern times something that is graphic journalism through Joe Sacco. He's not an Orientalist, but he has, the depiction of the foreigner. So I wanted something local. So armed with all this background, I wanted to see how I could tackle the issue. So again, to go back to the mojo of Joe Sacco, honesty, objectivity, I thought it's all about the narration, and it all starts with once upon a time. You give a clear picture. It's not just about the fact, You want to go, present things in context, take your time, and tell a story. Now, we had a few constraints, with the NGO. They told us that, we had 15 pages to tackle the issue, and we had another constraint, which was, when you approach the displaced, please do not talk about religion, do not talk about politics. Two things I could not do, obviously, but I had to tackle them through indirect ways. So one of the ways I did tackle this issue was through cooking. And cooking, why? First of all, the majority of the people that were in the tower were women. And as we know, we are confronted to a very conservative society in this tower. We have 200 people there, and the majority of the men are the breadwinners, and the women are there waiting. So there's a lot that is contained, and they want to speak, and they have suddenly this guy who's like a shrink coming and asking them questions about cuisine, and through the cuisine suddenly little stories are going to appear, and this is what I try to do through my comic. Tell little stories, show something, a different angle, and not show, whatever is going to be captured by the media outlet. We all know about the misery, we all know, but they don't, the comic industry has to show something different, something more subtle, that's story, again. And so this is what I try to do. I'm not going to cover this part. There's a method, when you're approaching the displaced, you take pictures, you write notes, you get a recorder, you sketch. Obviously, when you're sketching people, they're going to feel more at ease. They're going to think you're a bit more original, and you're not a mukhabarat taking pictures. Meantime, voilà, this is the problematic of objectivity and honesty, the approach and reaction. And so this is my work, some of my work. So macro to the particular. So I wanted to start with something a bit dramatic at the beginning, so you can't really read the text. So I wanted to start with catastrophe, and then journalists that are depicting what is happening, and tackling the issue of refugees, which is today a global issue. But it is definitely taking Lebanon from the harshest door. Like, we are receiving the biggest number proportionally to the size of our country. So there is a dramatic issue. So again, going back to the subjective part, it is, me, the narrator, who's like the underhero, who's like saying shit when I see such, numbers coming of, these people without faces that we don't see. We just see numbers, and we're afraid of the numbers because we don't know how to tackle it. Again, in terms of treatment, Andy, you tackled it quite well when you said that comics can show infographics, and they have ellipses, and you can use maps to define all that. So I thought using first of all the cartography to understand where was the Hassoun Tower located based on Tripoli, and the roadside, like how much time it takes. There's the issue of the coffee and the ellipse that and the transition that I'm going to make on the. So this is the last page, and it all ends with the famous tradition of coffee reading that we have in the Middle East, where we're supposed to predict our future through coffee reading, and apparently in this part of the story, the 2 cups of coffee had similarities and had 3 dots. So I wanted one of the ladies to say 3 spots again, and we're going to accuse me of connecting the fate of our 2 countries again, which is the eternal story between Lebanon and Syria. So the shared fate of the 2 countries, and I talk about how in Lebanon we had to also face a civil war and misery, and how basically I think that whatever we had to live through the 15 years of civil war was like a little aperçu of what was going to happen later on in our region. I ended by saying that, just read it. Voilà. I'll pass the word to Lena.
Thank you, Kemal. So, where there's life, there's love. The thing is, a Palestinian psychologist called Leila Shahid told me once that hostility comes from the fear of becoming like the other. And being Lebanese, going to the north to meet with the Syrians displaced in all the undocumented or unofficial camps, I thought that it would be important to show the intricacy of life and what keeps us continuing to live, what keeps us rather than surviving, living. And I thought that it would be interesting to show also what passes through from a generation to another, which is something I've explored previously in my work. The Lebanese, having lived the war also, having been also displaced, having also lived the hardships that the Syrians are living today. So what I focused on also is not really the journalistic side, but rather, of course, going, observing, asking questions, but then giving the voice to them. So it is really the narrators are them. There's no me in the story. I'm actually transparent there. So this is how it starts. When we came to Lebanon, we walked 3 hours to the border with a group of about 200 people. Every day there are 2 or 3 groups that come. And something that struck me is that there were a lot of plants, a lot of greenery, and every plant had a name, every plant had a kind of a history that was told to me. And in fact, the story was that they rented a landfill site that was a dumpster. There was garbage everywhere. They rented the land, and slowly they started to build it into what has become their home. So then here in the last image, I included, the greenery that they have planted throughout this time. So, but also there were different scenes that were looking like alienated people, also detached from their homes, and despite all of this, in the Akkar camps, our lives continues. So I have met different people, but all of them they had a lot of strength. They communicated that a lot of I would say power, if you want. Especially the women, so every day they had to maintain their habits. They had to, do the routine of waking up, going to the fields, working, then coming back, feeding their kids, sending them to school, doing different things. Particularly this woman who's called Fawziya, and she basically thought to bring her mother and also adopted a child on her way, and despite the scarcity of money she had from the organizations that helped, she was still helping this little child. The method is basically we go, we document, we take pictures, we take sketches, and a lot of children come, and I don't know if you can see these sketches. Yeah. And a lot of kids come and they want their portraits. I think these are 2 slides to tell illustrators, comic artists. Drawings are something very friendly in different spaces. Sometimes we are afraid to draw in public, but in fact people love drawings. They often come, they ask for more drawings, they'd like to see how these are done and all of this. And this is one of the results of the drawing in that research. But also what I have done is also I have included their own images that I have retraced. This is one of the drawings that the story of a teenage girl who refused to speak but was always drawing, and she drew me this picture that I've transferred to the comic book. So, I mean, I was focusing really on the inside life, the life of the everyday, to show that basically, in the end, despite all the hardship, life continues, and all the matters of life continues, from studying, from playing, from dreaming, from eating or not liking the food or arguing, but also the life of teenagers. So I was trying to show the different stages of the generations, from adults to old people to mothers to but also teenagers. And here they were telling me the stories of the series that they watched in the night with all the children while all the children slept, and they were watching a lot of Bollywood series and dressing up also in saris and playing role playing. this is another. This is the last page that shows also how I asked them, about the traditions and how they could continue to celebrate life. And in fact, a lot of the traditions they brought back. They here there's the story, how when the bride gets married, the money is stuck on her dress. And then everybody eats together. In the camp, it was by turn, so everybody is eating alone. So here, in this comic, I chose to really highlight the message of hope, and resilience that these families gave me. Something that I think and I consider I have learned from living the war in Lebanon. So thank you for this opportunity to speak here, and thank you for staying so long to hear me speak. Yeah. Oh, questions?
I know it's the last panel. Oh, there we go. We have Justin. Just a minute.
Yes, I had a question for actually the three of you, since you deal in the same media in journalism. How do you deal with the visual of what you present? Is there a specific style to comics journalism, or is there a wide range of possibilities? I was thinking about the photographies, because you showed some of the photographies you took, and I was thinking of Le Photographe, the Guibert book, and how he uses, for example, photography. And do you sometimes use photography in what you do? Or do you always redraw things? What are the visual questions which you ask yourself when you start doing, and are there specific answers because it is comics journalism, which would be different from mainstream comics?
The process, I didn't take any photographs in the Calais jungle because it's not acceptable to do it, because people have to remain anonymous. If you take a photo of someone in Calais and then they get to the UK and they make a claim for refugee status, then you could use the photo to prove that they were in France first, and then their application would be denied and they would be deported back to France. So there are no photos of, there shouldn't be any photos of Calais refugees. I mean, I think if you've put a French asylum claim on and you're back in the camp, then yeah, you could take a photo. But in general, you can't just take photos. It wouldn't be acceptable. So I used photojournalism that was online, so I did a lot of internet research because other photojournalists have been there, and I used that for some of the buildings. There are areas of the book which I wish I had better visual reference material for. Parts of the Dunkirk camp, I just had to go, well, I am just going to have to draw it how I want it to look, because I went in there once for 5 minutes and I can't really remember exactly how it was. I do like things to be as accurate as I possibly can. But that was the one good thing about making the portraits, is I was making portraits of refugees and then giving them the portraits. And I would change people's appearances and people's names so they couldn't be identified. But I still did use real people's faces in the book. And I was glad that I'd made those portraits, so I had that ability to do that. I don't know whether you change the style. I mean, I've done all kinds of fact-based comics, and the fact that it's journalism, I suppose, implies that it's contemporary, but I've done historical work as well. It's always just striving for accuracy, and also being able to rely on the shorthand of, you have provided a visual image. So you don't have to describe a whole load of stuff that you would have to do in text. All the way through, you can rely on the stories to carry a narrative as well as the words. And I can pretty well see what the shape of those pictures need to be from the point that I've got the original script. Like, I'd come up with the words, and then I'd kind of just know what pictures need to go with them.
That's amazing about the note-taking photographs, because it reminds me so much of the Akubo, of not being allowed to take photographs, and so actually the only way to visually depict something is through sketching. That's fantastic. But in answer to the question, there's no real house style, for comics journalists. Even just at this table, there's a huge variance. I personally made a choice in about 2010 or 2011, and I changed my style. I naturally draw in this very cartoony, sort of monster-y style. If people have read the early Samandals, they can remember that. And I wanted to do more serious work and talk about difficult issues, and it seemed like I couldn't figure out a way to do it using these really cartoony characters. And so I taught myself how to draw more realistically. But I don't think that was necessary. That was just a personal choice. I know plenty of people that use a very cartoony style to write about really serious stuff.
Do you want to add something?
Well, I think that Andy said it in the beginning, that in his talk about, marrying whatever is graphic, maps, everything with the style of drawing that you have. But I was struck also about your presentation, because what I did is I cut all the pieces and put them so that I can present them in a better way. I also have a background in graphic design, so I didn't think, of preserving the actual pages and the panels of the pages where I've inserted also the photograph where I've pasted the images in. These are not in the comic. I put them for the presentation. So, presentation, comic.
For me, it's a matter of language and influence. I'm going to create some sort of a synthesis between the two. That's like, voilà.
Jonathan.
Thank you all for these really, I love how your presentations are all related, but came at it from your own personal perspectives. One of the questions I always have when reading comics journalism is something really kind of basic, but something Justin started to raise, is the relationship between text and image. And sometimes I see comics narratives that are basically like textbooks with occasional images. I think the way you've shown maps, Andy, is really interesting. I think both of the refugee narratives have a really nice balance between storytelling and images telling those stories. But I'd be interested in hearing what's your own personal approach so that things don't become too word heavy or didactic. Or one of the things I love about comics is the reader has to do a little of the work. But how do you do that while still kind of enriching and informing?
It's very hard. I mean, fiction is you're adding, things and creating a narrative, and it's. I think I used this metaphor last night with my friend, but it's additive sculpture, and nonfiction is reductive sculpture. So you're taking this huge block of the real world and hacking at it until you get to something that makes sense, that gives you a narrative. And the constant struggle is to not include what you want to include, because there's so many amazing stories, there's so many amazing paths, and it hurts.
If you drew them all, you'd be there forever.
And it'd be super boring too.
So long.
Yeah.
You just edit and edit and edit and edit and edit. So I start off with reasonably brief text, and then I go back over and I take out all the words that I possibly can. And to the extent that I've had some, I got some journalism work a couple of years back, and I had to write 200 words, and I couldn't write 200 words on the subject because my writing style for 20 years has been about writing the minimum amount. So I was like, I'm going to have to pad this out. I'm going to have to go back and put words in, which, I say, the opposite of journalism. How do you arrive at the...
Yes, I'm coming.
It's a complicated question because I think it's a matter of identity, so it's all about dosage. If you want to be the pedagogic mad scientist, you can go with rambling and talking a lot. No, it's a style. It's something that can have its charm. Or on the contrary, you want to be the person who's immersed, who's a participant. Maybe it's going to be more about like you said, that there's two parts. There's the voiceover part, and there's the participative part. Mm-hmm. So this is also a dosage that we need to take into account, like what you want to tell more. You as an author, as a narrator who's present, who's living it, or you're the one behind the scene telling the story. it's a matter of dosage at the end of the day, and there's no secret recipe for that.
I try to get as much human conversation to carry the narration as I can. So I try to get, switch up and focus on different well, they're not characters if they're real people, but different narrators to carry the narrative on. I mean, I've done a book, it doesn't technically qualify as journalism, about climate change. So it's a graphic book explaining the science of climate change, and that was really hard to do. So I invented 3 central characters and then sparked a dialogue between the 3 of them. The mad scientist put me in mind of them, because the mad scientist was one of them, and then there was a big fat capitalist, and then there was a tiny, questioning and very angry girl. But if you, rather than having text, you can always find people, or you find the humour. You invent. I was just reading your book about everyday objects, you just invent silly dialogue with people getting cross all the way through, and that really livens it up as well.
Yeah, that's a classic technique. There's this American cartoonist, Larry Donek, who sort of made his career doing explanatory comics about anything from physics to history to whatever, and it's always sort of boring, dry subjects, but the way his secret sauce for it is having this back talk of the characters of the narrator. But then you also have, this isn't comics journalism, this is memoir, but I just reread Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, and that's almost entirely like narration blocks. She has very little dialogue, and yet it works beautifully. So there really isn't one path.
What she does there is she splices that up with incredibly beautiful visual metaphor.
Yeah.
So it's a narration block of a sentence, but then the picture carries you on a parallel journey.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
Same way.
Yeah.
Hello, good evening. This question's directed towards Andy, though everyone's welcome to weigh in. I'm an occasional reader of the Nib, and you've got no shortage of content criticizing Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, fake news is kind of the buzzword lately. So I'm wondering if the role of comics journalism in objectivity. Do you think it might be a beacon of objectivity because it just takes so long to make, it takes longer to make than writing some bullshit article? Or since it's not like photography, you can just exaggerate or skew things to your own view? What do you think?
I think that's a fascinating question. I have 2 answers to it. First off, thank you for reading the Nib. But also, so the objectivity thing is a really interesting question, right? Because you're actually drawing the images. And this is the classic counter-argument against comics, is that by drawing the images, you're interpreting them, and therefore it's not an objective form of journalism. And that does have some validity to it. I mean, it's actually impossible to dispute that. That's just what we do. And somebody once, I think it was actually after I did this piece on Boko Haram, pointed out to me that I had drawn this one character's face who is a pretty murderous thug, but I'd always drawn him with this very dour, angry expression. And she pointed that out to me, and after she pointed that out, I actually have made sure since then to try to make everybody that I draw, if I hate them, have as neutral of an expression as possible to sort of push back against that. Because you really can influence the reader, the way they think, the way they feel about a character, just by changing their expression. And if you're working from a photograph, except for Trump, I draw Trump very angry, because I just can't let that go. But it's an interesting point. I don't think it's a problem that is solvable for comics journalism. I think it's just something that we have to live with and do our best to be as objective as we can through that layer of subjectivity. And to be fair to us, when you're editing a documentary, you're picking the shots. Photographers take 30 photographs and they choose one. So there always is a layer of subjectivity in editing in any form of journalism. Ours is just a little more naked. The second thing, though, that I really think is a good point that you brought up is the quickness of it, right? So when you're making comics journalism, it takes so long that you actually can't ride the news cycle. And so it forces maybe a slightly longer view on your work than responding to the most immediate crisis, the most immediate outrage, because if it takes a week to produce, the media has moved on, so you need to find a different angle into it.
in view of time frames, in the 10 months that I spent drawing the novel about Calais, events have overtaken it and the jungle has been demolished. And it's really agonising working on a contemporary graphic novel about right now's political scene that is now the year before last, at the point when it comes out. And I thought, oh my God, this is like making the Bayeux Tapestry and trying to have it be contemporary at the point when it comes out. It's so irritating. I've never tried to be objective. I don't believe that anybody is. And I think when you're faced with evil in the world, taking a halfway point of sitting on the fence, where you've got good and you've got bad. Do you want to sit on the fence and let's give it equal weighting to good and bad? I don't get it. I mean, I quite unashamedly have a point of view, and I want to share that with people. I've got a complete commitment to accuracy in what I do, but I will create subjective narratives. When I did the book on Rosa Luxemburg, I was creating a biography of her life. And so I created baddies out of the people who murdered her, because they were bad and they murdered her. And I drew them looking nasty because I could. I mean, I do that, actually. If you look at the French riot police in my book, they're not sympathetic portraits, and I feel genuinely sick when I draw them. But I want the emotional charge of that story to go across to people, because I want to see people to see that the police in France are not acting in the public interest in the way that they treat pregnant women and children.
Hear, hear.
Are we going to tackle this part or no?
I mean, I think that it's more about honesty, and I think that works with comics, because also, I mean, with the examples of Sacco, where he actually drew himself in the comic, speaking. So I mean, there is this honesty with himself and with saying what he thinks and being involved in these in the actual site and all of that.
It doesn't turn them into angels like the Palestinians. Like, he still shows them under their true face, but still shows his sympathy towards the Palestinian cause.
Kemal, do you want to add something?
No.
Okay, I think, unless there's someone who's going to raise their hand and tell me stop, thank you. I'd like to thank, first of all, my amazing speakers, all of them, and especially the ones on the panel right now.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, audience, everyone, for staying here so late. We know it's late at night, but when we did it last year in the daytime, people said we can't leave work, so this is why we did it at night or in the evening. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for this support and just and asking your questions and everything. We hope to see you next year again. There's another symposium at LAU, I think, at some time. So, no, maybe? Okay. Anyway, I promote comics wherever it is, including out of AUB. And so thank you, everybody here. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, winners. Thank you, everybody. And we see you, hopefully, again. Thanks.